Hey folks, thanks for joining our 2025 webinar. So just by way of an agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about what happened this year in the landscape, privacy roles then and now, always interesting topic. What we think is going to happen in 2025 as well as what we've seen, what teams should prioritize in Q&A. But for those of you who have joined privacy webinars with TrustArc before, you know that these are meant to be fluid and it's kind of like, peeling the onion. So some of these in the beginning here, you might have seen in our mid-year recap. But just as a bit of a refresher, I'm going to talk a little bit about what happened the first half of this year and then the second half of this year, just at the beginning here. But there was a lot of activity, lots of U.S. enforcement actions. There was some activity around things like DoorDash, GoodRx, BetterHelp, and others. A lot of these were around sensitive or health data and how sometimes through the use of tracking or other technologies, it might actually trigger certain obligations. Similarly, there was some activity around the EU Digital Market Act, particularly for gatekeepers. I imagine some of you or many of you are not gatekeepers. You might work with them. They're typically the largest companies, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, and Microsoft. And it's really about requiring powerful companies to allow more interoperability and and avoid preferencing their own services. Some cool things came out of that. The choice screens, the ability to add additional consents or change services, etc. The best thing since Ross and Rachel, will they, won't they, with Google and delaying cookies. If anybody's seen Friends, Google delayed cookies this year, deprecating them from Chrome. And we can talk a little bit more about what we're going to see in 2025, but it's not officially, restricted from a third-party perspective. There was another federal law proposed that I think many of us were excited about watching, at least the progress on, since initially it seemed like it was bipartisan, but it was stalled again. There was the Protecting Americans' Data from Foreign Adversaries Act, which focused on data brokers, and lots of state activity. You can see the list below, but particularly in addition to some comprehensive laws, there were some laws around healthcare and children's privacy that percolated a little bit. Team, anything else you want to add on the first half of the year that we might want to raise?
We saw a lot of class action litigation around the Video Privacy Protection Act as well. That was, some of that carryover from 2023 as well, but that's one thing I've noticed as well.
As well as CPRA, right? The California Invasion of Privacy, as well as the Video Protection Act. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Lots of that, and we'll certainly be talking about that more. And I think that's something that we expect to see into 2025. So same sort of thing here. The second half of the year included more privacy enforcement dates. There was some more federal activity. The Chevron decision got overturned, which is incredibly divisive. And I think if you ask different people, they'll have different opinions about why that is. And I'm going to paraphrase, so somebody stop me if I've misspoken here, but it basically overturned a decision that allowed the courts to defer to executive agencies on certain subject matter expertise that they have had for decades. So those were some of the many things that happened. Again, PADFA had some particular focuses on North Korea and others. And yeah, that is your 15-second recap on what happened this year, since we're primarily focused on talking about what's going to happen next. I think, I'm going to pause here and just sort of ask Ami, Cynthia, and Andy, what do you think are some of the other key themes here? What are some surprises that you saw this year rather? What weren't you expecting that became such a focus?
I think one of the things that I was really surprised to see was that, we had this concept of a splinter net where there were all these bespoke requirements for different jurisdictions. It felt like for a while they were streamlining towards one another, where it was much easier to simplify, or at least begin to move towards that direction. And the last half of this year has shown that, no, we're just going to go right back to being as protectionist about our data, about how we want to regulate, what we want to regulate, and how we want to regulate.
Yeah, I agree with Ami. We see that with, obviously different states in the US, and then we have the upsurge of AI versus privacy, right, regulations. And then in the EU, obviously, there's so much going on from a regulatory standpoint. I think it's frankly very difficult to comply or even figure out, how you get your arms around it. A couple other themes that I thought were interesting in 2024 was the notion of personal liability, right? We had some former CISOs that were, right, and that actually became less of an issue potentially than I thought it would. I thought that would be a stronger theme. I don't think it's going away necessarily, but again, that was something that I thought kind of peaked, and then it flattened out a little bit. And then we have the SEC, the disclosures, right, 8Ks, and that has created, let's say, more information, maybe not necessarily super relevant, because, you know, we had the SEC come out and say, hey guys, stop filing 8Ks and saying, well, we're filing the 8K, but it's really not material. You know, no, that's not. But again, it creates more information about what's happening inside companies. So those were some of the other themes I thought.
So Cynthia, just to double down on that, when you're talking about the AK, you're talking about the cybersecurity disclosure rules that the SEC.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Yeah, just for the audience's benefit.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
I think one thing that surprised me this year was that AI, at least internally as a lawyer inside a company, AI has pretty squarely landed in the privacy team's lap. And I wasn't exactly sure that would happen. I think my assumption was many privacy teams, because they're so close to the technology, might, jump in and take those issues. And certainly in law firms, I think we definitely saw a race to get, notoriety and acclaim around an AI practice inside law firms. That didn't seem to necessarily always triangulate around privacy or infosec. It can come from a lot of different places in a law firm, the IP side of the house, like tech transactions, other parts. But internally, it pretty squarely felt like AI is moving into the privacy tech transaction side of the internal legal team. And I think I expected perhaps maybe that to be slower, but it happened pretty quickly to me.
So on that note, one of the stats that I passed along to our board earlier this year was actually that there are 45 states proposing AI bills this year, right? It's a triple digit, bill count across the country on AI. So I think that's actually a really good segue that Andy you just kicked off. But what do privacy roles look like now versus last year, and what do we think they might look like next year? Right, because I think that to your point, AI has become part of it. But I'd love to hear more from you all. What else has happened? How have your roles changed, or how have you advised clients differently, internally or externally?
I can go.
Go for it.
I don't know that it's going to depend particularly, I think, on the company and the company's surface area. I think, at my company in particular, we are not yet at the stage of thinking through AI in our outward-facing products. The first line for us has been the engineering teams need to use these tools, right? And we need to support and buttress their abilities to do that. The first and foremost, internal governance, assessing what needs to be done, not just from a data privacy perspective, but just holistically. Like, what do we expect from AI tools and some of the co-pilot type tools that engineers want to use? The first line for me was that, plus the overlapping IP and open source type considerations that might come from using some of those tools. And then I think I start to think about, okay, what data is at play? Is it going to involve any customer information or anything like that? So that's where I started, and that's where we started to kind of expand in a concentric circle around our use of AI. And now we are in the early stages of thinking through how AI fits into the product suite.
Yeah, I would say it's similar to what Andy said, just trying to think through AI concerns are going to be different based on whether it's consumer, HR, product, finance, supply chain. For example, consumer side, it's going to be more like tone and brand reputation, data usage and consent. On the HR side, you're going to see a lot more major privacy concerns. Whereas on the product side, you're going to see IP concerns, and finance. I mean, it's mostly just sensitive information that you may not want a model to ingest. But in terms of, in terms of AI, I mean, it is extremely time intensive to integrate, and it can be extremely expensive for a lot of organizations to adopt. So what we've been focusing on is more than like Andy said, an outward facing tool, getting the engineering teams up to speed, the product teams, trying to understand how we want to use it, but what are the minimum AI governance standards we want to impose, and what training do we want our teammates to have? It's something that is going to evolve, especially as we see more requirements coming from the states. And we also are going to see a lot more, we're going to see changes in also how industry responds to them. Industry is also going to have some self-imposed requirements as well.
So from the outside perspective, right, to piggyback on what both Ami and Andy said, we are being asked to help companies structure their AI governance frameworks, right? Whether that's with respect to the use of internal tool, either building or integrating or acquiring internal tools into their products, or or interacting with vendors, right? And how, what kinds of terms can they impose, or should they impose, or how much can they sort of see behind the curtain, to reference Wizard of Oz, and right, a hot topic for currently. And so I think that's one thing that we're seeing that sort of builds on the data use and sort of privacy, privacy regulations, but it is a discipline in and of itself, right? Sort of what Andy said. I think the other thing that we have seen is, like, on the M&A side, a real uptick in the acquisition of either developers specialized in developing AI, right? Or acquisitions of data sets in particular, right? That companies can use in sort of building their own tools, or just, the different sorts of technologies. And then I think a lot of it, I think Ami touched on this as well, but it's focused on obviously regulations and compliance, but brand reputation, right? And what does that mean? And messaging, and how are we messaging internally? How are we messaging, externally on these issues?
I mean, AI is sort of a bellwether, I think, or rather, there have been other bellwethers, but AI is similar in that I think privacy roles have been shifting in general over the last couple of years. And I think some things that, some folks would say, oh, well, that's a different department, right? Like resiliency or vendor management or security or other things like that we may have had other folks that we leaned on. It's all kind of come together a little bit more, right? Whether that means we're taking on those responsibilities more, or we're leaning on folks more, or we have to pick up more expertise, et cetera. Like AI covers technology, it covers IP, it covers confidentiality, has privacy risks, et cetera. And then there's this whole concept of, are you developing it? Are you consuming it? Is it internally being developed or consumed? What are your clients expecting from a flow down perspective? Can you even warrant AI in the same way that you warrant, using Amazon Web Services as a cloud provider? I think that these have created this sort of fascinating environment where you really have to think about a lot of stuff that, yeah, I mean, you've all touched on it, but like, some of you all on this webinar or who are listening in haven't had to worry about IP or HR issues previously. And now here we are, right? We get to be really like, and I know I'm stealing somebody else's comment here in the notes here, but a jack of all trades a little bit with some of it. So question for the group here on that point, and I'll share my view as well. How else have privacy jobs changed, right? Like, what do you think has happened over the last couple of years beyond AI? A couple of things that I've seen is some folks are changing their titles, right? We're seeing a lot more folks who are adding like privacy and AI or privacy and data officer or something of that type. I think two is, especially since, for those of us who were, doing this before GDPR, I think the expectations and the level of visibility that this function has dramatically changed. Like I said, for those of us who kind of grew up around GDPR or prior, there was a time when we were in the basement with fluorescent lights reading about GDPR, and now we're in front of the board talking about the risks, right? So I think that dramatically the role has changed in that regard, which is amazing, but it also means that, for me personally, I've seen a real change where a lot of folks that I've run into, either both here and in my prior life, they just can't focus like they used to, right? They can't read the regulations, front to back anymore. On top of that, they're now being asked to opine on exactly, what else is AI going to be a risk for, even though historically they might not have been IP counsel as an example. And so I think that the privacy function, for privacy leaders in particular, has become a sort of a mile wide and inch deep, much more than it used to be. So I think that's been the biggest shift. And I think that's a hardship for some of us who love to dig in and kind of know the front and back of something before you execute. But we'd love to hear from this team, what else, right? What else have you seen beyond sort of the AI governance work, of how this role has shifted?
I think you said it pretty well there. That difference between, having to go a mile wide, especially salient in a smallish company for me, where I just don't have the same types of resources that I've had in the past in other companies or partners, around the business to work with. It's really difficult. It's possible, right? Really on your own to keep up with everything that's happening. So you've got to have a mix now of really good outside counsel to help you see the landscape that they see, as well as a network of GCs and CPOs that you can talk to, and consultants too. Like, I think depending on what your business is or your vertical, that can be a really effective way to have another set of ears and eyes on stuff. Overflow, you know, overflow lawyers, like using temp counsel, like we're doing that right now to kind of fill the gap when we're not ready to bring an FTE on, for example. But I think the broader point here is we're a highly regulated business. Anyone that touches personal data at any volume is clearly a highly regulated business at this point. Even if you're just focused in the United States, just look at the number of state laws we're dealing with, right? Look at the federal laws. Like there's enough to satisfy many full-time jobs in most organizations. And I think there's a reality and realignment that needs to happen. And I think one way that that's showing up is, as you mentioned, Val, changing titles, shifting the kind of landscape of what people are owning. They're pulling in kind of a bigger ethical tent or a data risk focused tent around those things. And they are trying to encompass what is the broader thing that we're here to solve. In some organizations like Google, for example, like many of the privacy folks are now embedded in product. I think that's certainly like one path to take it, because privacy has become a ubiquitous requirement in product counseling. So that's sort of one example of where I think we've seen a bit of a concrete shift. I don't think the CPO thing or title goes away. I just think it gets, comes maybe a bit more amorphous, encompassing. If there's an opportunity to do more, if you want.
I think it changes, and it should, right? Like we shouldn't be in the same position as 2018 when everyone is learning what GDPR is and what personal information is. But I find that, when you head a privacy program, your focus really now today has to also be on data governance, data security, data ethics. You are going to be, or even if you sit within the privacy team, you are going to be called to answer those questions, mostly because you're not in just one part of the business. You have to go across functions. You have to also understand the data sets and how those data sets interact in your operational processes. So I think it does become an expansion. It sort of is like a jack of all trades when it comes to the data, how the data should be combined, how it should be used, what is ethical, how should the future of that data look? How should the security of that data look? I think also there's, a lot happening with the expansion of AI that I think is just another iteration of how data, you are a jack of all trades when it comes to the data. How is that data going to be used? So really, you kind of end up being the head advisor to how to be the most responsible steward of that data.
And so to piggyback on that point, like what we're seeing is less of a focus from our side is less of a focus on, I mean, there's always compliance questions, right? And new regulations and how do we comply? But that function for outside counsel, I would say is less, that's less. Most people now, there are more people who understand the basics, right? And so I think from our perspective, it's to what Andy and Ami just talked about, which is like, how can we assist, obviously going super specialized and deep, where you can't because you don't have the bandwidth or the time. And I've got a team that can go look up those rules and regulations and get you something that's sort of bite size and ready for you to implement. But I think it's also, how can we sit alongside those teams and scan the horizon, right, in a larger way to be able to kind of see around corners and see trends and work with companies on their risk-based approach, their principles. So yeah, I mean, yeah.
Do you think, Cynthia, that your clients, the ones that you've worked with for a couple of years, are asking fundamentally different questions now than they were a few years back? I mean, look, I know the laws change, but I'm just thinking even about my own experiences and how, 6 years ago, I was probably asking Lothar Dieterman, who also works at Baker McKenzie, what is a data processor, right? What is a data controller? And these days, I find in the conversations I'm having, people are having conversations with their outside counsel about private rights of action or litigation or just far more complicated stuff, and stuff that isn't necessarily just about like, what does this term mean, right? A great example is like, I remember asking outside counsel, like, what is cost-contextual behavioral advertising? And by the way, Andy's the one who helped me answer that question years ago. But I think that's been a big shift. Have you seen that same shift, or have you seen kind of a status quo?
Yeah, no, 100%, right? I mean, again, and what we're seeing is to the point made earlier, which is we're seeing it everywhere now, right? And so we're seeing it in M&A, we've already gone full sort of, that's come 180 degrees with respect to reps and warranties around privacy, and obviously now AI and using data sets and right, and compliance with laws or potential laws, right? And so we've seen that shift, and so that there's that complication. I think the other thing is, we kind of touched on this a little bit in our prep call, but we're seeing things differently from, I mean, we've seen that like with respect to limitation of liability and indemnification in contracts and agreements, right? So we're looking at, again, it's not just a specific isolated privacy compliance question. It's, okay, how does this work across the business? What have we acquired, right, with respect to risk, whether that's privacy or data use, and how do we integrate it? And then I'm seeing in larger companies, we've got working with more specialized teams, to Andy's point, like, more sort of product counsel or hybrid teams that came up through maybe an IP background that have shifted over into AI, or, and so again, it's also the people we are talking to inside the clients has changed as well, right? Which reflects, or, I mean, it's the same, but it's a larger group of people. And to your point, Val, which is that it's a board level issue. If it wasn't before, it certainly is now. And so we are helping clients present to the board, understand the risks from that perspective, not just a management perspective, but from, a fiduciary duty perspective, right?
Awesome. All right. Holy moly. If you look here, and for those of you who love math, I know lawyers are really good at math. If you count the amount of laws that are in effect in the US and went into effect this year, that is the same as the amount going into effect next year. So there is a 100% jump nearly in new US state privacy laws just next year. I think that's a really huge point. And I want to double down on it for a couple of reasons. One, because I think that a lot of folks are constantly asking the question, what do I do to get more buy-in internally, right? What do I do to get, my peers or the executive team or the board or whoever you're talking to buy into this more? And I think this is a really salient point because, I have heard a few times, isn't privacy hasn't privacy been around forever? Like I've heard things like that because, well, for us, we live and breathe it. If you talk to folks kind of one or two levels removed, like they've been hearing about GDPR and CCPA on TechCrunch and Gizmodo and stuff like that for a while now. But things like this, the enactment of the Indian Data Protection Act, I think are showing that privacy is still very much a sleeping giant. Super fascinating fact. Cisco's privacy study that they've been running for about 4 or 5 years now. So this was the first time since they started running their study that more than half of survey participants in jurisdictions with a privacy law were even aware they had privacy rights, right? Those are like fascinating points to think about holistically, because I think that for a lot of us here, particularly folks on this panel, like we've been living this stuff for so long that it's easy to forget that, if you think about the public at large, or like I said, folks 1 or 2 steps removed, this hasn't been a top of mind for them perpetually in the same way. So this is an easy reminder. Hey, there's going to be 100% increase as an example. And a little bit of artistic creativity there. I struck the Vermont because that did get vetoed by the governor, but you can see it here because it was, you might have heard about that one. Cynthia and team, can you talk a little bit about some of the trends and themes that you're seeing in both the US laws and others that you think the audience might be interested in hearing about?
Sure, I can jump in. Well, so I mean, children's privacy is, and that's gone back and forth, right, for different reasons. And I think, and then we saw that Australia just passed, right, a law with respect to children's privacy, I think, or social media use. I think it's questions of accountability. Who's accountable? I think ultimately we are seeing that, I mean, we're talking, I guess, yeah, health data. I mean, I think also we're seeing an uptick. We didn't address this, but it's related, right? But it's deep fakes and, use of personal data, even going beyond, right, what we would consider potentially personal data, but even with respect to people who have passed, right? And I think just looking at how are you using, again, which kind of gets to brand reputation. So I think, states are continuing to move into this space. I think, Val, what did you say? 45 states have AI bills also. So we add that on top of the consumer privacy laws. And again, it's questions of bias and disparate impact. And I'm not sure how you wade through it, right? But yeah, no, yeah.
This slide to me, we're in December, right? This is the perfect time to have this slide, which is like, this is your budget slide.
Yeah.
As you're thinking through, how am I going to tackle 25? And that you may want to layer in the rest of the world, a slide that looks like this for the rest of the world, and a slide that looks like this for AI. Those 3 things, if you drill into this is why you are going to need the budget that you need next year. And this is how you're going to make a case, if you need to, that you need an FTE for next year or 2 or whatever you need. Like this forms the basis. Now the trick is not to say, this is the world we're facing and look how regulated we are now and it's overwhelming, we're going to have so much work to do. I think you need to take these slides, look at them, and think about, all right, when we put budget towards this, when we put budget towards privacy and towards compliance initiatives, how does it impact our business? How does it impact our business going forward? How does it accelerate our business? How does it accelerate products that we want to build? How does it make us more trustworthy with our partners and customers and as a vendor to those customers? That's what these slides are for. All right, well, if we're really good in these areas, then the wins are tenfold. And so I think that's when I look at that, and maybe this is just sort of self-preservation when I look at this kind of slide, but that is what I look at. And I think, all right, well, here we are, we've got a lot on our plates here, but how are we going to tackle it? We're going to put together the internal team, we're going to put together budget towards an external team, and we're going to go tackle those problems.
I think sometimes companies have this blind spot where they have lots of like content customers who like they misappreciate what can happen if the silent majority shifts, right? And I think this is a perfect example of that. If you're a SaaS company as an example, and you have customers in all of the states, right? There could be hundreds or thousands or dozens, depending on the size of your business and your deals, and et cetera, that haven't asked you for anything, right? They sign your standard terms and they're perfectly content and everything's great. And for a lot of us, with GDPR and even California, we saw that shift with those geos. You're going to continue to see these shifts where these organizations, which may have been a little bit more accepting of, let's say vendors' terms as one example, in these geographies are now saying, hey, wait a minute, like we're more regulated now. We have more obligations. Our citizens in this state are becoming more aware, right, using that Cisco stat. So like Andy said, this isn't just about fines or risk. It's about your go-to-market ultimately, right?
Yeah.
What happens if a bunch of your customers in a bunch of states or in countries, because I mentioned, like I said, India is still very nascent with its privacy law. These are places where there will be an awakening, right? Where companies are being asked by more and more people, what are you doing? And those companies in turn are going to ask you all, what are you doing about it? Right? So that's what you need to be forecasting against, not, hey, look at all these. I mean, look, you should do that as well, but it's not just about private rights of action or class actions or, fines, although those are obviously critical, but those are just one vector, not the vector, in my opinion.
There's a good question in the chat, in the Q&A about.
Yeah, I think everybody will have some views on that.
So I guess one thing to the point that Andy made, I think what's important when you take consumer awareness, right, which you mentioned, Val, is up, which means that your consumers are better educated and more aware, right, of what's happening and how their data is being used. And so you can't ever exclude them exercising the choice to not give you their data, right? So I think that's something that, when you're looking at to Andy's point about mapping to this with your go-to-market strategy and the growth strategy, how dependent is data, right, on your revenue strategy for 2025 and 2026? And if it's highly dependent on it, then you can't neglect, right, these regulations, not just from a compliance, strategy, but you may not have the data that you need because your consumers opt out of giving it to you, right? Or your partners don't give it to you because there's a brand issue, right? Or there's some sort of issue. So I think that's, to me, that is maybe more compelling to a business, right? Or it's like when you talk to engineers who are building, AI tools, and you tell them that if they do it incorrectly, well, the FTC might come in and tell you that you have to disgorge it, right? So you have to throw all your work away. So I think, that's where mapping the regulations and the issues to, the growth strategy and the dependence that companies have today on data, which is only increasing.
Just to quickly add to that, so wholly agree with what Cynthia is saying, and I would add to that, even if you're just a vendor of companies and you need to process device level data, much less first party actual, PI, you have to prove that through compliance questionnaires. You have to get through an onboarding process. You have to get through a annual recertification, InfoSec questionnaires, all of these things. So like, if you don't have like a plan and program in place to answer those questions, you slow down the go-to-market as well. And so it's even, I would say it's even even important in a simpler, kind of go-to-market motion.
I think one thing to add is, so you can look at this map and see that there are state privacy laws. They're all going to read differently, but in this box, we're talking about health data laws, children's data laws, wiretap statutes. There's a lot of uncertainty, and let's take children's privacy, for example. Like, what does that mean? There's actually no consensus on what is children's privacy. We all say we want to protect kids, but in some cases, some of the laws, the way the drafts have been written is there may be an over collection of data, which is a danger in itself. Oftentimes it's trying to balance harms to children versus their freedom to develop appropriately on the internet. But what I've noticed a lot is it's very vague. It's, thrust to the states or some regulation. It's a can that's kicked down the road. And it oftentimes puts a burden of similar waiver and consent onto the parents or to the caregivers. And I don't know that parents or even teachers, for example, are meaningfully informed as to what the difference is between a waiver and a consent. So I just want to point, I use children's privacy as like the best example of how we want to have health privacy. We want children to have privacy. We don't have agreement as to what that really means. And so Cynthia was talking about, making sure your data practices are clear. What I would say is, I use this context to kind of underline what Cynthia said. Make sure your data practices are clear, because you will have to have a position one way or another.
So a couple of interesting things to add on that. Maryland is one example of one of the laws coming down the pipe, has a strict prohibition on selling kids info. And so there's also there's these cross sections happening too, where there are children specific laws, we got a couple of them last year, like the Maryland Age Appropriate Design Code, Colorado's amendments to the CPRA, Virginia's amendments, etc. But in addition, there's all these specific sections now in these comprehensive laws, like Maryland, around that. Additionally, just to kind of highlight some other state nuances that we're thinking about that are courtesy of some of the folks in Baker McKenzie and our knowledge team, just to think about are in Iowa, there's no right to opt out of profiling and targeted ads. So I think like we saw with Washington, My Health, My Data, and some of the other health statutes, I think what Ami's talking about is incredibly important, which is that sometimes you're going to have to take a position and there's not going to be some holy grail where it's carved into on what that position is. You're going to have to make an informed, view on how to handle or execute against some of those things. Similarly, Minnesota is the first state to provide additional consumer rights considering profiling, such as to question the results, be informed of the reasons for the decision, etc. So those are some of the things to certainly look at. And I think one other point about healthcare data that I think might be helpful for folks to understand is the health data environment is shifting dramatically for a couple of reasons. One, there are some changes to how HIPAA is being interpreted based on Texas and others. But two, for those of you who haven't been tracking, Washington, My Health, My Data, and some of the laws that followed after were in response to Dobbs, which is a Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. And it pulled in information into the crosshairs that you could argue wasn't always in the crosshairs, which is tracking technology data, right? Historically, if somebody worked in a health adjacent space and they used cookies for things like ad performance or targeted marketing, etc., those may have not been considered for purposes of health data. And some of these laws have created specific requirements and have specifically pulled in that data as covered. And we saw some of that starting to happen a couple of years back, a little bit subtly. If you look at the Sephora decision in California, you could ask, why Sephora when this was probably a broader issue? Well, it's because companies like Sephora sell things that might indicate, your gender, they might indicate your age, etc. And so while these newer laws are related to or in response to Dobbs, you kind of saw the tides shifting a little bit where what is health data and the sensitivities around health data started to shift. I think children's data we've all kind of known is sensitive and important, although the law is now catching up more sufficiently. But with health, I think we're now realizing that, this other stuff like going to a pharmacy and just ordering moisturizer might count too. which has been super fascinating. Cynthia, do you want to talk a little bit about the recent enforcement trends that we've been seeing?
Sure. And I have to say, I expected a little different, right? When we drilled down into the numbers, because we thought, hey, you know what? Maybe we should have some real data for the presentation and actually pull the numbers. I was a little surprised. And so just because it appears, frankly, across the board to be rather flat, right? And I'm generalizing, but we have, we have fines have increased under GDPR, but the number of GDPR actions per year has actually went down, right? From 2023 to 2024. Query whether that was, we also had the EU AI, Data Act, right, come into effect. And so has focus kind of been moved to other, other regulations potentially in Europe? And so that's sort of kind of spreading, again, the focus on away from GDPR. In 2023, the FTC announced a settlement of 14 data privacy actions, the highest tally on record. But I think last year was, or this year, then 2024, I think was like 10, So again, it's following a similar pattern, right? If you look, it seems like 2023 was a peak potentially. And then, so I just think, and again, even, I guess we don't have or do we have that on the next slide, Val, the SIPA and others?
We do.
Before you advance to SIPA, I think one comment on, I can't really comment on Europe as much and the trends there per se, other than to say that, in sort of like guessing, it's just been around longer, right? It's been around for a while. People have compliance organizations in place. They have spoken with regulators, talked to them. I think they have a good understanding of what's expected. I think in the US, it's obviously very different. We have, all the different state laws happening. You have a change of administration, which was mentioned in the Q&A, like the obvious sort of like change of administration, pullback on regulatory activity, spend that are going to be available to the FTC, staffing, et cetera. They're clearly going to focus. The one thing that seems obvious is there's clearly going to be like a focus on like kind of the antitrust side, maybe loosening up and more M&A activity, more IPO, markets happening. So I think that's sort of the obvious stuff. What's, maybe a layer underneath that is kind of trying to figure out and decide what the FTC is going to focus on versus like on the privacy side versus like whether there's going to be more enforcement or less, or whether they would have, more budget or less or more activity. I think what I would say in kind of just doing like tea leaf reading or just thinking about what might happen is, it seems to me that health data and health focus and children's data and children's focal points are like pretty clear issues that don't really have like a party affiliation or alignment and seem to be like just trends that are worth assuming are going to continue and they're going to continue to care about. And then we can prognosticate later about a federal privacy law, but I think that's where I would leave it on the FTC front.
Ami, what are your thoughts on that? If there's any planned legislation, do you expect any enforcement or legislation to scale back with the incoming U.S. administration changes? I'm going to add U.S. for the audience since not everybody's listening in is from there. But yeah, would love to hear your thoughts.
I think we're going to see more state AG action, and maybe they coordinate. Some state AGs, some agencies, like for example, the California Privacy Agency has signed a letter of coordination with CNIL in France. I think we'll see more of that. I think that will also, one AG doing that can also hearken to other AGs what is possible under their laws, especially because a lot of these laws, even though they're not they are unique to the states in which they were passed, they're largely the same when it comes to the sharing and selling of information. So I think it remains to be seen how the state AGs, especially because now they are a lot more sophisticated in understanding how data is used and managed within companies.
Totally agree with that. Yeah.
I feel like I feel like it's like Chevron, where I've heard so many like strong opposing opinions on this that it could certainly go either way. I think that there are certainly folks who think that the chances of a federal bill actually increase with control of more, you know, the House and the Senate and et cetera. So I think it's, you know, I'm going to give a boring answer, but I think it depends is sort of the boring answer here, which is that we could see a number of things. I do agree that the more sensitive topics, i.e. children's law, AI, will continue to be regulated. That feels relatively certain. I'd put $5 down on it, you know. But I think beyond that, I think that it's going to be really interesting to see because, for example, with the AR with the former federal bill, there was not only bipartisan support, but there was actually quite a bit of a tech lobby that wanted a federal bill because it would actually, in their opinion, ease some of the transaction burden. And the question then becomes, would a, you know, Republican-controlled government actually be some more supportive of industry's needs there or not? So I think, you know, we all probably have differing opinions on.
Here's what we do know.
Yeah.
Right. As fact, the last version, you know, was not only stifled by this, but one of the roadblocks is Ted Cruz's point of view on a private right of action and not wanting to enable the plaintiff's bar in doing so. So I think that's one like fact that we know that that's going to be a position that has to be negotiated or has to be figured out or dealt with if there's going to be anything that moves forward. I think probably like the other thing that we probably know is that it's not going to be the first thing the administration tackles at all. Like they have many other priorities that they're going to focus on separately. And so like realistically, will they even get to it before a midterm? I think that's really like where I start to think about, unless they're really ramped up to go do this in the next year and a half, it seems hard to envision that happening, at least in the first half of the next administration's term, to me.
I think one thing on that point is that, and this goes back to what we were talking about previously, which is originally, you know, data was data, and then there were regulation, you know, sort of data use, and there were a few people, you know, practicing data privacy right in their basement. And it's no longer, it's not even just a high level, I wouldn't even say, you know, data use, right, is not just a high level issue, it's a political issue, right? And I think when you're assessing how you use data, you know, what your go-to-market strategy is, who your consumers are, or whether you're a vendor, or who your partners are, who your customers are, you need to view it through that lens. And I think, you know, and there's shifting, you know, there's shifting perspectives on this. And so how are you integrating those issues into your data use or data collection, data processing strategy? And that is a trend that has heightened and is not going away.
So just keeping track of time, my suggestion is that I think if we could quickly touch upon this, I do want to leave 4 or 5 minutes for, you know, us to just do a quick roundtable of, you know, what do we suggest that folks focus on for the next year. But I do think this is helpful. So Cynthia, do you want to lead us through some of this excitement?
Sure, happy to. Again, you know, we wanted to drill down into some numbers. So obviously SIPA litigation, which has been a huge topic, and that actually continues to increase, right? So, you know, 224 cases filed in the first 4.5 months of 2024, which, you know, I think we can expect it would be double potentially, or at least what was filed in 2023. To Ami's point, you know, state privacy enforcement, I think we will see an increase in that in different ways. Again, we have new regulations going into effect. We have seen attorneys general grouping together right, for different actions. And then BIPA litigation has, peaked in 2020, but it remains high, right? So the last number we had is for 2022. It was, increased from 2021. Again, I think that when you're looking at, facial recognition technology, deep fakes, sort of all of those issues, that leads into, that's squarely within sort of BIPA issues. And we do have some states at Texas, other states, right, that passed laws like BIPA. So again, I think we are, I think this is where we anticipate continued, let's say, enforcement momentum.
That icon,
And just for the audience,
that icon should be the BIPA icon, by the way. The Baker McKenzie putting it out there. The slide where that should be ubiquitous BIPA.
Yes. Just for the benefit of the audience, CIPA is the California Invasion of Privacy Act. The background there, and we actually have a ad tech webinar that we did a few weeks ago that you can listen in on demand, is that basically Nixon era wiretap laws are being conflated with modern privacy laws. And instead of looking at whether somebody had a cookie banner as an example, they're looking at 2 and 1 party telecommunications consent rules. And plaintiffs' counsel are reaching out to folks and alleging, that they're wiretapping if they're using something like a certain pixel from one of the big tech companies, as an example. And BIPA stands for the Biometric Information Protection Act, right? I'm not butchering that, am I? Okay. I know that we're only leaving a few minutes for this, but if we could just do a power round, I'm going to pick on you first, Ami. What are some things that you would suggest for the audience that they should be thinking about or focusing on entering the new year from a governance and kind of practical perspective?
Super not exciting, very not fun, but vendor management should be a big deal. It will very much be a big deal in 2025, mostly because if one of your vendors goes down, your operations will go down. I think the demand of already very understaffed teams is that you can't just do your questionnaire and checklist. I think going forward, the expectation will be you do continuous assessments on your vendors, their readiness with how their readiness fits into your own operational resiliency. And again, because you end up being the data advisor, as to how to be the best data steward, vendor management is going to be your ticket there to success. Again, not the most exciting, but likely the most important.
100%.
I'll go with data minimization. So I think that's another one, is looking across your data maps, if you have them, looking at the different products that you're developing or have already developed, data flows within those, and thinking through at least running an analysis across all of those and saying, are we keeping the data that we need? Are we dropping the data that we don't need? What is our approach to minimization? I think at least at a floor level, you have to have thought that through.
Cynthia?
I think both of those are great. And so I think my point on that, which touches on both of those, is your contractual rights and obligations, right? So whether that's vendor management, whether that's with your terms, with your customers, potentially to Andy's point, we see data minimization becoming part of a requirement with respect to contracts. But I think we're seeing an increased focus on limitations of liability, indemnification, and frankly, look, there are certain companies that you contract with, and they may have an obligation to you with respect to damages, but if they're not good for it, is it worth the paper you signed, right? So to Ami's point, if you sign on a vendor or someone to do something and you operationalize it and they go down, but you can't actually get any there's no recourse in the sense that they don't have anything to give you. I think that is an important point and will become more and more important.
My parting thought on this, which I admit might seem self-serving now that I'm at TrustArc, but I would have said this even if I wasn't here, is leverage technology, right? There's a lot of low-hanging fruit stuff that just isn't worth the brain damage. Like there are certain things like when you're creating a data inventory, like basic descriptions of your system, there is technology that can help you describe, what is a HubSpot or what is a Salesforce. You don't need to spend a bunch of time like wordsmithing something like that, right? So leverage technology to do things like that. Leverage technology for some of your more basic research questions. Go to your experts for the more important ones, but leverage tech to do the things that you simply don't have time to do anymore. Because we've talked a lot about how the role has changed, the amount of stuff has changed. That also means that we can't obsess over whether there's an Oxford comma in the right place sometimes. And instead, you really need to, I do that sometimes as well, but leverage your technology, leverage your stack, make sure you have the right stack and the right advisors like Andy's talked about. Because those two things can make a world of a difference in terms of how quickly you can move to adapt to this, shifting need. So that's my parting thought recommendation. And for those of you wondering what these insights are from, they're from our privacy benchmarks survey, where we surveyed a bunch of people. So these are just some takeaways. Anyways, we're well past time. So I did want to thank our panelists and all of our guests for attending. Thanks, everyone. Have a great year.